The lantern goes dark, the fleet turns back, and nobody, not London, not Manila, not the history books your kids read, ever explains why. Welcome back to Echoes of Ancients. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe. We dig up the stories they decided to forget. Now, let's talk about one of the most audacious trade confrontations in Southeast Asian history. A story where local merchants, not armies, not colonial governors, forced one of the most powerful commercial empires on earth to pack up and leave. By the way, the British East India Company at its peak was intimidating, not just to small traders, but to entire kingdoms. It had its own navy, its own private soldiers, its own courts. It could wage wars, sign treaties, and bankrupt a dynasty before breakfast. When it moved into a new body of water, the local economy reshaped itself around British terms. Or it collapsed. Those were usually the only two options. Except here, except in these islands. Incidentally, the Philippine archipelago by the late 1700s was not some passive victim sitting around waiting to be exploited. People forget that, or maybe they never knew it. Because the version of Philippine history that gets taught tends to skip the parts where Filipinos won, and this is one of those parts. Dig back further, centuries before the Spanish galleon trade locked Manila into a single corridor of commerce, and you find something extraordinary. The islands were already plugged into a vast, sophisticated trading network. Chinese merchants, Malay traders, Javanese ships, merchants from Borneo and the Sultanate of Brunei moving goods through these waters like they owned them, which in a functional sense, they did. Filipino traders weren't bystanders in that network. They were active players. They had their own vessels, their own routes, their own relationships built over generations. Beeswax, gold, forest products, cloth, these weren't just commodities. They were leverage, and the people who moved them understood leverage better than any company accountant in London ever could. Here's the thing about a network that old. It has memory. When the Spanish came and tried to funnel everything through Manila Bay, the network bent, adapted, went sideways. Informal trade routes persisted outside official channels because that's what networks with memory do. By the time the British East India Company started eyeing Philippine waters seriously in the late 1700s, they weren't stepping into a vacuum. They were stepping into a room that was already full. Now hold that image, because understanding what the company actually found when it arrived, that's where the story gets sharp. Let's say, and the answer involves a type of resistance that doesn't show up in military records at all. The British occupation of Manila from 1762 to 1764 is one of those historical footnotes that deserves a much louder voice. During the 7 Years' War, Britain took Manila. Just took it. A naval expedition, a ransom demand, a stunned Spanish administration. For almost 2 years, the British sat inside the walls of the city and tried to figure out how to make money from it. They failed. Spectacularly. Part of that was logistical. Part of it was political. Spain negotiated Manila back through the Treaty of Paris in 1763 before the company could fully exploit what it had grabbed. But part of it, and this is the part that gets quietly filed away, was that local commerce refused to cooperate. Wait a second. The internal trade networks that fed Manila did not open themselves to British middlemen, merchants who had operated for generations under Spanish arrangements, who had their own understanding with Chinese traders, their own credit systems, their own informal guilds. They didn't switch allegiance just because a new flag flew over the fort. They waited. They routed around. They made themselves inconvenient in 1,000 small ways that never show up in a single dramatic battle but add up to something significant. Think about what that takes. No formal coordination, no written manifesto, just a collective, almost instinctive decision by people who knew these waters and these markets to simply not participate. To let the British stand in an empty room wondering where the goods went. This isn't romanticizing. This is economics. A trading empire needs trade. If the trade doesn't come to you, you have nothing. And the merchants of these islands had spent centuries building the relationships that made trade flow. The British had been here for 5 minutes. There's a catch. The company made subsequent attempts. After the occupation ended, interest in Philippine trade didn't disappear from London's agenda overnight. There were proposals, expeditions, efforts to establish commercial footholds through back channels. Some of those records exist in fragmentary form in British archives, enough to sketch the outline of repeated frustration without filling in every name and figure. What those records sketch is a pattern of failure that company officials attributed to Spanish interference, to geographic difficulty, to a dozen external factors. What they don't say plainly, because admitting it would require a particular kind of honesty, is that local commercial resistance made their position untenable. Stop for a second, because we need to name what this actually was. This wasn't primitive stubbornness. This was sophisticated market strategy executed by people who had been running trade networks across maritime Southeast Asia for longer than the British East India Company had existed as a legal entity. The asymmetry of that fact is almost funny. Almost. The pre-colonial Filipino merchant class, the people who had built wealth through connections to Chinese trade junks, through access to gold from Mindanao, through forest products that European markets were desperate for. These were not simple people overwhelmed by the machinery of empire. They were the machinery, their own machinery. And they knew how to shut it down for outsiders who hadn't earned a seat at the table. There's a concept that historians of Southeast Asian trade use, sometimes called the port polity model, where power doesn't come from controlling land, but from controlling the flow of goods through a node. Whoever controls the node controls the conversation. The rulers and merchants of the Philippine archipelago understood this intuitively. Spanish colonialism bent that system, but never fully broke it. The British attempted to insert themselves into it and found the node uncooperative. London buried this. Not through secret orders and dramatic cover-ups, but through the quieter burial of omission. The story that gets told about the East India Company focuses on its successes: India, China trade, the opium corridors, the parts where the machinery worked. The Philippine chapter, the frustrating, expensive, unproductive Philippine chapter, gets folded into a footnote about the 7 Years' War and left there. Filipino history textbooks, when they mention 1762 at all, tend to frame it around the British occupation as a Spanish problem solved by Spanish diplomacy, which erases the local dimension entirely. The merchants who made the occupation economically hollow, the networks that refused to integrate, the quiet, grinding, commercially lethal resistance that made British presence here a losing proposition before it ever became a political one. Your ancestors did that. That's what gets erased. There's a particular kind of violence in historical omission. It doesn't burn anything. It just removes. It takes a story of agency and replaces it with a story of passivity. And enough generations of that replacement, and a people start to believe they were always passengers in their own history. That power always came from somewhere else, that the ships that mattered were always foreign. The ships that mattered here were local. Incidentally, the trade routes that shaped this archipelago's connection to the wider world were built by Filipino and Malay and Chinese Filipino merchant communities across generations of negotiation, relationship building, and hard commercial intelligence. To be honest, the knowledge of which monsoon season moved, which cargo where, the credit relationships that let a trader in Cebu trust a partner in Fujian, the capacity to absorb a bad season, reroute a shipment, wait out an unfavorable power at the gate. That's what defeated the British East India Company in these waters. Not a naval engagement, not a diplomatic masterstroke from Madrid. To be honest, The slow, patient, commercially devastating refusal of people who knew exactly what they were doing and had been doing it longer than their opponents had been a company. On the other hand, the company left. Manila reverted to Spain. The trade networks continued, as they had always continued, along routes that outsiders drew maps of without ever quite understanding. And London wrote it down as a logistical inconvenience. Some inconvenience. Stop. The archive doesn't always tell the truth. Sometimes it just tells the story the winner was comfortable with. But underneath that, in the fragments, in the trade records, in the patterns of where British commercial energy flowed after the Philippine chapter closed, the actual story is readable, if you know what to look for. Here's what you should take from this. Not pride as performance. Something more useful than that. The merchants who outmaneuvered one of history's most powerful commercial empires didn't do it with weapons or formal alliances. They did it with knowledge, with network, with the patient refusal to let someone else define the terms of exchange in waters they had navigated for centuries. That's not ancient history. Moving on, that's a strategy. Some rooms you don't enter by forcing the door. You're only allowed in when the people inside decide you've earned it. The British never earned it. Never.